Hey guys, welcome back to another art video. So in this video I'm doing a fan art portrait of Jordan Mathewson, also known as Kootra. He has his own gaming channel, but I actually discovered him from the Creatures. So they're like a bunch of gamers that just hang out in the same like office area, and they do like interesting activities, so they're quite entertaining to watch. Moving on to the materials, I'm using my new Holbein Oil Pastels on Fabriano Roma paper, and from what I heard, Fabriano Roma is pretty hard to get your hands on, and they almost always have to be custom ordered from Italy, so they're pretty hard to purchase. And from my research, I figured out that Roma actually used to have 8 different tones of paper, but now they minimized it to only 4. They only have white, beige, which I'm using right now, gray, and green for some reason. And that's kind of sad because I really enjoy using toned paper, especially when I'm working with really opaque materials. But it really isn't that big of a deal because essentially you can just take the white paper and dye it whatever color you want. I've seen some of my classmates in university do it, but I really do like using this paper. There's a slight, really fine texture that will show through the oil pastels, but I kind of like that slight texture because it gives a little bit of interest to the painting. And I was a little intimidated to use this dull brown paper because Holbeins, as I mentioned in my previous video, they aren't that opaque for an oil pastel, so I was afraid that the pigment wouldn't be that intense on such a dull paper. Although if you do press hard enough, you can get a decent amount of pigment onto the paper, so I was trying to do that throughout the entire painting. And these Holbeins were having the same problem as my Caran d'Ache oil pastels, which was kind of surprising. They were made inconsistently too. Some felt as hard as chalk pastels, and others, especially the black one, would be so soft that it would almost melt in your hands. And that explains why I was wearing gloves to prevent the really mushy oil pastels from getting all over my fingers. Although towards the end it was getting really sticky since like a lot of moisture was trapped in my glove. So I ended up taking it off just to give me a more comfortable feel when I was completing the painting. It is sort of uncomfortable to wear gloves while you're working on a painting because then there's an extra barrier that you're introducing between you and the medium. And I just feel like it makes the painting process less of a joy and more tedious, so I prefer not to use gloves, although especially if you're working with permanent medium that's hard to wash off, then it's advised to use gloves more often. And they do make a plastic case to put your Holbeins in. I've seen it somewhere, and I think some of them make them metal too, but I find that the problem with those is that you have to keep changing your oil pastel stick. So especially if you have the full set of 225 Holbein oil pastels, then it gets kind of tedious to constantly change oil pastel just so you don't get a whole lot of pigment on your fingers. Anyway, so a couple of days ago I went to my nearest Blick store to get some more Tiziano paper because I only have small notebook size sheets of them and I wanted a large sheet to work with. But unfortunately they were all out of the colors that I was interested in, so I didn't end up getting those, but I did get to try out some Sennelier oil pastels that they displayed there, and surprisingly they felt a lot like Caran d'Ache oil pastels. They were soft and creamy and like quite opaque, probably the same opaque intensity as Caran d'Ache oil pastels. Although I'm guessing that they won't have that same inconsistency in their texture. That was the kind of problem that I was having with both my other oil pastel brands, even though they are artist quality oil pastels. So I've only tried a couple of them though, the Sennelier oil pastels, and from what I was trying, they seemed consistent. But I'm not entirely sure, so if you own a decent set of Sennelier oil pastels, please let me know in the comments if there's a consistent texture within all of the pastels or if some feel harder than others. I would really appreciate that information. So back to the drawing, I was having a little trouble with the St. Louis logo because oil pastels are never the greatest media for detail, though I do think it's easier to get details with the sharper edges of Holbein oil pastels rather than the others. But in all honesty, once the edge wears down, then getting details is just equally as hard as using any other oil pastels, so it's not that much of a plus to have square oil pastels unless you use an X-Acto knife to constantly cut a sharp edge through the oil pastel once you dull it out. Then getting details would be a little bit easier, but unfortunately, again, having the full set of 225 makes that task really tedious and just a bit of a burden, so I'd prefer not to do that. And so I was just using my standard eraser stick and makeup blender to do the blending, although it seemed like the makeup blender wasn't doing much blending to the pigment, and that's probably because there wasn't enough of the oil pastel material on the paper. Because creamy oil pastels, I feel like they're much easier to use up because the material just spreads on the paper effortlessly with like the least amount of pressure. But hard ones tend to last much longer because not that much pigment gets laid on the paper even though you're applying a lot of pressure. So that's another thing that I was having a challenge with overlaying colors, since Holbein's weren't that opaque and they weren't that creamy either to apply. It was hard for me to get like lighter colors once I underlaid a darker color on it, and then to get highlights I would try to push the oil pastel as hard as I can, and I would have to push it a number of times to get it to that opaqueness that I wanted. So that was a little challenging, but other than the inconsistency in the texture of the oil pastels and trying to get details with them not being that opaque, I enjoyed using these Holbein oil pastels and I look forward to using them in future videos. But I also want to try and use like all of my oil pastel brands in like one illustration to take advantage of all their different properties. So I was thinking I would start off with the Crépats and Holbeins just to do the underlaying shadings, and then I would do the highlights and refine the painting with Caran d'Ache oil pastels since they're easy to layer on top of previous oil pastels. And I was just thinking that this would be a really great way to use up my cheaper oil pastels, because as of now I was thinking, well, I have Holbein and Caran d'Ache, I might as well throw away my Crépats. But it does make more sense to use them in like an underpainting where the color won't matter that much, but it still helps in creating the painting and using up your materials to the best of their ability. So that's what I was thinking of. And when I finished this painting, I turned the Roma paper around and I saw a huge oil stain from where I applied the oil pastels. So it seems like the oil from the pigment just seeped into the page, which is very interesting. I've never seen that happen before. Probably because I'm used to using cheaper oil pastels, so like maybe cheaper ones don't really have a decent amount of oil in them to actually, for the page to actually seep into it, and maybe that's why higher quality oil pastels are easier to blend with because they have that higher oil content. But I don't know, I'm just throwing out ideas. Although I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing because I'm just planning to laminate this drawing once I'm done, so for me it doesn't really matter. But if you're using it on a notebook, then it might transfer onto the next page, the oil content, so that might be something to be worried about. Anyway, that's all I really have to say about this painting. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video.